she was about to reply, and then she said, wait a minute, oh, well, I love my own mother, of course, she said, and then my father. And then she thought for a minute, then she said, oh, and then, of course, your father. And, oh, and then you. There was a kind of hierarchical arrangement, which she obviously thought was the way it was done or felt. But nonetheless, it was very mystifying to me at the time, and not a little hurtful. It's curious, though, that you should say that you would not, supposing this had occurred between you and your mother, this would not be something you'd write about?
No, no, I wouldn't say that. I'm saying that hasn't occurred between me and my brother.
But it was, you must admit, an odd thing, an odd exchange.
Sure, and you also say that you recounted in some detail, or you hope you got the detail correct, because you want to show the warmer side of your mother's personality.
Yes, that was rather a nasty dig, wasn't it? I apologize to my mother's ghost for that. In fact, my mother was an extremely complicated and interesting woman, and I suspect, the more I think about her, that she was some kind of an artist, or she had some frustrated artistic ability. She certainly had a very interesting and sardonic sense of humor, and in that respect, I think the character of Edna was influenced by her personality.
What sort of a family was it, and what sort of... I mean, there's bits in the book where you're talking about your relation between your mother and your father, and it appears to be a fairly Puritan... A family that hated talking about illness or sex or anything
Yes.
to do with reality.
It was a very puritanical background. It was, like many Australian backgrounds, one haunted by the ghost of the Depression. The experience of the Depression was something which remained very palpably in the air in my youth, and not just in my experience, but most of my contemporaries knew about the Depression from their parents. And as in the late 30s, the rising middle classes decided to house themselves in attractive bungalows in various styles, from Spanish Mission to jazz modern to Californian bungalow. So my father, who was a building contractor and a designer of houses, accommodated them. And as a kid, I was taken from one building site to another, and I watched these suburban villas arise in bushland. Gum trees were felled, native Australian grasses were burnt off, English lawns were planted, silver birch trees were installed. No trace of Australia was apparent. We were, in a way, living in a suburb of Bournemouth.
I mean, one of the strange things about that is that to some extent you have, I mean, you've gone to live in England with the birch trees and the green lawns,
yes,
and away from the gum trees.
I've
You've also, to some extent,
adopted
the style of an Englishman, I mean, in the suit and the delivery. Is there an irony in that, or not?
Well, I had thought of wearing shorts and long white socks.
You should have
but
done.
It seemed inappropriate. I'd never really felt that I was anything other than an Australian. Some Australian journalists of the less humorous variety have from time to time challenged me in this and asked me what I considered myself to be now, you know, as though, you know, I'd somehow become an honorary Scandinavian. As you know, as an observer of Australia, as a, if I may say so, an honorary Australian, as you are.
A new Australian.
A new Australian. You must have observed that when Australians, and particularly politicians or journalists or disc jockeys, wish to appear good fellows, they find someone who they think is being unpatriotic, and they berate them in public. I came back to my family home a few years ago, when my son had been, soon after my son had been born, to introduce him to my mother, and she was characteristically listening to the radio at that time of day. She was listening to a phone-in program, a talkback program, which happened by a dreadful coincidence to be about me. The disc jockey, who has since unfortunately died, was saying something like, I haven't personally seen Brian Humphries' new show, but I hear that he is portraying Australians in a very unfavourable light. And if he puts this show on overseas, it's going to do no end of damage to our burgeoning tourist industry. We'd like calls on this, please. Yes. And women would ring up and say, well, I haven't seen Barry's show either. But if that's what you say, Pat, I quite agree with you. Well, I'm there trying to show my son to my mother. And from time to time, she's glancing in my direction, going, shh, shh, listen to this, shh, shh. As more and more ghastly attacks upon me come over the airwaves from, I'm afraid, it's not my greatest fan club. You know. So, in the end, my mother said to me, pointing to this transistor radio, you see, Barry, she said, that's what everybody thinks of you. And I think this was an expression, really, of her genuine distress. I think she was upset to hear these words spoken of her son, but at the same time, she tended to agree with them, because it came from the radio. You know, it's an old-fashioned belief that what comes through the airwaves, either through the television screen or through the radio surgery, happens to be the truth. You know, as you know, it's not always the case. In desperation, I went into an adjacent room and telephoned the radio station using Edna's voice. I said I wanted to be put straight through to the studio, Possum. My impersonation was so successful. I got straight on air. And I said, in the character of Edna, I said, I've been listening to this show, and I quite agree with you, and I quite agree with all those nice ladies phoning in, and I happen to know Barry's mother agrees with you as well. I then went back into the sitting room where my mother sat. She turned off the radio, gave me a very strange smile.
An old-fashioned look.
A very old-fashioned look. And then she said, now let me see my grandson.
Did she ever go to your shows?
Oh, she went to several of my shows early on.
I hope she never arrived late.
She was never late, but she's, of course, a very sorely missed person in my life. I was very, very sad not to have been in Australia when she died suddenly. And if she emerges from the pages of this book in a less than sympathetic light, I was really describing my perception of her and the other people in my life as it was at the time, you know, as I experienced these things.